Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndall Curtis. The federal government managed to stop one boat today, the super trawler the Able Tasman, after a public outcry. The government's now strengthening its legislative hand, demanding more science and a 2-year pause before deciding if the ship can fish in Australian waters. While talks have been going on for years about bringing in the super trawler, the government says it only recently found out it didn't have the legislative powers it needed to deal with the issue. The government is finding the power to make a meal out of the Coalition's state government cuts, particularly to health and education. Joining me to discuss the day are Labor MP Stephen Jones and Liberal MP Alan Tudge. Welcome to the program.
G'day, Lyndall.
We'll go first to the decision by the Environment Minister about the super trawler in Tasmania.
That when the law falls short, you change the law. And we will be changing the law and moving legislation in this parliament today to be able to provide extended powers over this particular vessel. We'll end up with decisions that are science-based, but we are not willing to rush at decisions when the underpinning information is still not yet before us. In this way, there will be a pause on different operations legally available while the expert work is done.
The government has effectively said the super trawler will be stalled until 1 year after the next federal election. That doesn't go far enough. The community wants the super trawler stopped. The community wants to make sure that we go back to the level of fishing that was allowable previously in terms of the quota.
Stephen Jones, doesn't this look like the government's made a decision in the face of a public outcry when the Fisheries Management Authority says the science was on the side of letting the super trawler go ahead?
Look, I don't agree, Lyndall, and I can only go on the feedback that I've received from my electorate and the expert evidence that I've had put before me from people from the recreational fishing industry, from science and from the publicly available material. And what I can say is this: we've got one of the largest fishing vessels in the world. It's got a 600-metre net that could encircle the Sydney cricket ground more than once. They are able to bring into their ship vast amounts of fish, catching up much more than their quota. There are some significant environmental concerns, and I welcome the fact that the ministers responded to it. If that means we've got to strengthen the law, then we should do that. But
discussions have been going on for years, haven't they, about bringing the super trawler to Australia? Why, when it's already in Australian waters, is the decision made now?
Look, there has been some discussion, Lyndall, to be frank. There's been some discussion even within our own party room about this issue, and I'd be the first to say that I was very uncomfortable with what was being proposed. It hasn't dropped a net yet into the waters, and I'm very pleased that as a result of this legislation it looks incredibly unlikely that it will.
Alan, I'll ask the question from the other side. This is the first time a trawler of this size would have operated in Australian waters.
Sure.
Isn't it right to do as the Environment Minister says and take a precautionary approach, double-check the science and make sure it's okay?
Well, we'll take a look at what the legislation is when it comes before the Parliament before we make the decision about what we're going to do. But to take up your point, Lyndall, I mean, this wasn't just on the agenda for multiple years. This fishing trawler was actually invited by Minister Burke himself to come to Australia. And they were invited to do so through this report, the Small Pelagic Fishery Harvest Strategy, which actually says on the first page there are considerable economies of scale in the fishery, and the most efficient way to fish may include large-scale factory freezer vessels. This was 3 years ago that Minister Burke himself launched this report
but doesn't
and invited them down here.
Isn't having an actual trawler here a little bit different to saying it might be a possibility?
But this was exactly the type of vessel which Minister Burke was talking about. In the meantime, Stephen, we've had the Australian Fishing Management Authority go through, assess the science and say that this would be able to operate in a sustainable way. As little as yesterday, we had Joe Ludwig in the Senate agreeing to the existing quotas, and yet today, completely out of the blue, we had the government make a decision which brings an immediate halt to this operation. So 50 jobs are lost today, Lyndall. It again puts in question the sovereign risk arguments in Australia, because this government can't maintain a decision for 5 minutes, let alone 5 months or 5 years.
If I can ask you, because it's not clear from what the coalition's had to say formally today, do you believe that the super trawler should be allowed to operate in Australian waters now?
Well, we'll take a look at the legislation which is put before us. We're not in government. They're in government. The Labor Party's in government, and they're the ones that made the decision, as I said, to invite them into the country. Our real criticism is the process which they go through, where they chop and change their minds on an almost daily basis. Good governance is about setting your policy settings and then sticking with them, even if there's a bit of public pressure against you. Because if you don't, if you make decisions on the run, then you create enormous sovereign risk for the country. And that's what we're hearing and that's what we're seeing today, right across the economy.
This issue of sovereign risk, because it's complete baloney. This is a ship that has been excluded from countless numbers of territorial waters around the globe. So there's absolutely no suggestion that this is a ship that is somehow now subject to some form of sovereign risk. Completely untrue that the ship was invited into the water. Yes, we do have some policy settings, but we do what every good government should do.
Here's your report. Minister Berg
listened very patiently, more than
Minister
patiently to you, Alan.
it.
The fact is this. Governments, responsible governments, will respond to changing circumstances, and when information is brought to the fore, when the Minister had information available to him that made it quite clear that there was gaps in the data, gaps in the research, gaps in the ecological knowledge about what the impact of this vast shipping trawler was going to have on our fisheries, he's acted appropriately.
Why didn't you raise it earlier?
What he's done is
Why didn't you raise it earlier?
He's looked at
Stephen.
Alan, what he's done is looked at the laws that were available to him. He took an initial step last week, was to try and work within the legislation that was available to him, formed the view, which is, I would say, in communion with most of the caucus, that those steps were inadequate, that we wanted to see it go further. So we're bringing forward a change to the laws, responsive and responsible.
A final question on this issue. The Minister told News 24 today that if the expert panel he's commissioning comes back and says the science says it's okay for this vessel to operate in Australian waters, then it will be allowed to. Will you be happy with that?
Look, I have deep concerns about whether a vessel such as this could ever operate in an ecologically sustainable way. But of course you would have to base that decision on the science that is available, and what the experts are telling me right now is we simply don't have the data available to make that call.
We might move on now. While the Senate's still debating the government's declaration of Nauru as an offshore processing country, another asylum seeker boat arrived today. The Minister will have the power to decide who doesn't go to an offshore processing country like Nauru, but he says he'll be cautious in making those decisions.
If I start issuing blanket exemptions and say, well, this type of person won't go or that person won't go, well, then the people smugglers will be out there using that. These are hardened criminals we're dealing with. They're hardened criminals with very close links to organised crime who will have no compunction in lying or spinning any government action. So I do need to deal with this with caution, and that's why I'm saying at this point that everybody who arrives in Australia is at risk of being transferred to Nauru and Papua New Guinea. The Act's very clear about that. Obviously there's some challenges here, just as there would be challenges for anybody implementing this policy, because it does take time to do.
Alan, would the policy work best if all people who arrive seeking asylum are sent to Nauru and there are no exemptions or very few?
Of course it would, but the policy would work best if all three prongs of the suggested approach are implemented. So yes, send people to Nauru, offshore processing, but also introduce temporary protection visas and turn the boats around when safe to do so. We've now had 20,000 boat arrivals since the government abandoned the Howard government solution. We've had 10,000 this year alone and 2,000 since they announced the Nauru solution. It is a farce, their border protection regime. They've outsourced it to the people smugglers business, and they need to reintroduce that three-pronged approach.
All slogan and no substance. If they really cared about expert opinion on this, they would pick up, you're right, this is not an issue that is going to be resolved by just taking one element of a proposed solution and putting it in place, because as the Houston report said, the people smuggler industry is very, very adaptable. They will change their strategies depending on what governments are doing around the world. So yes, we need to put in place offshore processing. Yes, we should progress the Malaysia arrangement. And yes, we should be putting in a range of other measures such as interdiction and working with countries around the region to get in place these regional arrangements. What they didn't give a green light to, what they were roundly critical of, was this nonsense that you can somehow push a boat back out on the open seas, or the temporary protection visas are going to work. We know they won't.
If I could go to the Minister's point, are you happy for him to exercise his discretion in not allowing people to an offshore processing country in few cases, even if it means that potentially vulnerable people are sent to a place like Nauru?
Look, I agree with what the long-standing human rights and refugee advocate Paris Aristotle had to say on ABC AM this morning on this, and that was you cannot have a blanket exemption, otherwise these ruthless people will stack the boat full of kids. Now, that would be the reaction to a blanket exemption, so I agree with him on that. I've got to say, deeply concerned about having unaccompanied minors held in these detention areas, and I think there should be some instances where you have a case-by-case approach to this. That is the best approach to it.
We might go finally to the issue of coalition state governments, because both Queensland and New South Wales have announced job cuts today. The Queensland budget, which announced job cuts and tax rises, particularly on mining royalties, and New South Wales has cut nearly $2 billion from education funding. Alan, given that your party is proposing cuts at the next election, would cut public services in government, is this a potential political problem for you?
We have announced already some of the cuts which the federal coalition would do in government. We've said, for example, that we would cut 12,000 public servants from Canberra. Basically, when people retire or resign, then they would not be replaced. Bear in mind that there's 20,000 more public servants today than there was in 2007 when Labor first formed government.
Although some of that number is made up by, I think, Defence Force reserves.
Most of that number, though, is public servants in new authorities here, and there's some authorities which we will abolish altogether, such as the Climate Change Authority.
Can I just say, there is an echo here going back to 1996, because I heard John Howard say exactly the same thing in the lead up to the 1996 election, 6,000 redundancies only by natural attrition. He then went through, held a commission of audit and slashed thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. Same form in Queensland, same form in New South Wales. They can't be trusted.
Kevin Rudd came to power with your government promising to take a meat axe to the public service, and you have imposed successive efficiency dividends on the public service, which is cuts by another name, isn't it?
Last election, we promised no cuts to the public service, and have now announced in the last budget 3,000 cuts to the public service.
You'll get your chance here, Alan, and I know you want to talk as much about anything except what's going on in New South Wales and what's going on in Queensland. Now, I'd be talking like you as well, mate, because you know as well as I do. You know a little bit about economics. You would know that what Campbell Newman is doing in Queensland is probably going to force a recession into that state. The level of public service cuts that are going on there are not only having a big impact on health and education services, they'll probably force a recession in that state. In New South Wales, we've just seen a $1.7 billion cut to the education budget, at the same time as the Commonwealth government is saying we need to increase the overall education spending pie. This is what Liberal governments do. It's in their DNA. This is what they do, and they cannot be trusted.
$65 billion of debt, which Campbell Newman inherited. $6.5 billion of deficit. That's what they inherited from Labor.
Has actually been blown apart.
That's where we'll have to leave it. I'm sure we'll continue this discussion at another time. Alan Tudge and Stephen Jones, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndall. Thanks, Steve.
And thank you for joining Capitol Hill. Please be with us tomorrow.